because we have a lot we would like to achieve between now and 6:30. So, good evening and welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to see so many people. I think this is our first event for the quarter, so it's a nice way to start the quarter. I'm Vered Karti Shemtov. I teach Hebrew and comparative literature here at Stanford, and I'm also the coordinator of the Hebrew Culture Project. And I will be the moderator for the event tonight, together with my dear colleague, Marie-Pierre Uloa. Marie-Pierre is an expert on film, and she teaches in the French department, and she is the associate director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. I would like to thank the center, and especially Professor Steve Weitzman, who is sitting here with us, for supporting the event and making it possible. I would also like to thank Linda Wayne. Is Linda here? Well, she's probably helping us somewhere else right now. Linda helped us coordinate the event, and so thank you. Some of you might recognize our speakers. We will introduce them now, and then we'll move straight into the conversation between them. In the middle, we will show two very short clips from the Israeli version of In Treatment, or Betipul. Our focus this evening is on therapy in literature and on the screen. And we have with us Yael Hedaya. She's a leading writer for the award-winning TV series In Treatment. It was aired in Israel from 2005 to 2008 and won the TV Academy Prize there. The series was later translated to English for HBO. In the US, it received the Emmy, Golden Globe, Writers Guild, and the Peabody Award, so lots of recognition. In addition to writing for screen, Hedaya is also a prolific novelist, and she won awards for that too. Some of her books include 3 love stories, Accidents, I have it right here, Eden, also came out in English, and they were translated to English, German, and other languages. Her latest work, Wednesday Evening, that came out in 2011 is especially relevant for tonight and for our discussion. It focuses on a group of interesting characters in their 40s that meet on Wednesdays for group therapy sessions. She's one of the leading female voices in Hebrew literature today. She's studied in NYU and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where she is currently teaching creative writing. We are grateful to her for taking the time from writing and teaching to fly all the way from Israel to visit us here at Stanford and to take part in this event. It's really a great honor for us to host her here. Marie-Pierre will introduce Professor Irvin Yalom.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Irvin Yalom here at Stanford. Irvin Yalom is a psychiatrist from Stanford, and I believe this is the 50th anniversary of your arrival at Stanford back in 1963. You are 62, so 51 years. He's a psychiatrist with a multifaceted career as a therapist, as a teacher, and as a prolific writer and highly acclaimed writer of nonfiction books and of what he refers to as teaching novels. Irvin Yalom published his first book in 1970 with Basic Books, and since then he has taken his writings into 3 main directions: scientific contributions, therapy tales, and teaching novels. So his first writing were scientific contributions to professional journals, and the first book he published, The Theory and Practice of Group Psychotherapy, is a classic. It's been widely used and read. It's a text for training therapists, and it has been translated into 12 languages and is now in its 5th edition. And this first book's success owes a lot to the writing style of the book, because it's a storytelling approach that he decided to adopt in this book, in presenting brief human snapshots, human vignettes sprinkled throughout the book. Other texts followed after that first book, such as Existential Psychotherapy, a textbook for a course that did not exist at the time. He then turned to therapy tales, intended also as pedagogical works, as books of teaching stories, and the most famous one of these therapy tales is Love's Executioner, which was published in 1989, and this book brings together 10 intense and touching accounts from his practice. And then, in an effort to really teach multiple facets of existential therapy, he invented a new literary genre, the genre of the teaching novel. And to this day, his most successful book is the very first teaching novel that he wrote, When Nietzsche Wept, which was published in 1992. And I should also cite Lying on the Couch and The Schopenhauer Cure. And When Nietzsche Wept was also adapted to the screen in 2007, and we will soon hear Irvin Yalom talk about his reaction to the film adaptation. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Yael Hedaya in a conversation with Irvin Yalom about therapy on the screen and on the page. Thank you.
To the conversation, and the first part is about writing about therapy for the page. We would like you, if you can, to speak about how does therapy on the page differ from a real session, what aspects of it does literature preserve, what is lost, what is added, the patient-therapist relationship on the page. Can writing about therapy help us understand it better? Does therapy provide insights about writing, about the author-reader relationship? And anything else that you would like to tell us about writing about therapy? So maybe, Yael, you'd like to start?
Okay, I'm not going to remember everything you asked.
They got the questions ahead of time. So.
It's like a memory quiz. I was like, oh. But I think the first thing I could say about the difference between writing about therapy and being in therapy is that writing is much cheaper than being a therapist. And I think that, I mean, it sounds funny, but I think that when I can't afford to go to therapy, I have a bigger urge to write about therapy, because it's like creating an imaginary friend, an imaginary therapist, and it's a pretty economical way to give yourself analysis when you're creating your own setting. But to be more serious, I think that for someone who is both a patient at times and a writer, writing about therapy is like a fantasy come true, because all of a sudden you have control over everything. And if, as a therapist, I always wondered what's going on in my therapist's personal life. You know, what he or she had for breakfast, did they have a fight with their spouse, and other things, you know, which I want to bring up here. Then in writing about it, I can create a whole world, and it's in a way like being a child playing with Playmobil. And I think that, you know, they say that writers are the best psychologists, that they have insight of the world, and they see into people's souls. And I think that also writers make good therapists for their characters. And I think that if you're a patient and a writer, you can really create a good character of a psychologist. So I enjoy it. I enjoy writing about therapy. How about you?
Well, one of the things that's on my mind very much, and I spent a lot of time in the last 2 or 3 weeks having the flu, staying home, canceling all my patients, but watching some of In Treatment again. I watched the first season, I watched a good part of the third season, and I am totally astounded today to meet you, because I was totally convinced that there was a major psychotherapy veteran behind the script here. To find out that you're not a therapist, it's because I absolutely love the show, and most of my colleagues that I know who've watched the show think very highly of it, and it rings so very, very true. With the exception of a couple of things that I'll be glad to talk about. The consultation sessions were way out, and that doesn't resemble any consultation sessions I've ever seen. But nonetheless, it was tremendously moving. So I was deeply moved and deeply engaged by this. And it does teach. Not written by therapists, but it certainly is a good vehicle, very good vehicle for teaching. I heard a quote by Abraham Verghese 3 or 4 weeks ago introducing someone saying, it wasn't his quote either, the origins of the quote are a little unclear, but that fiction is the lie that tells the truth. Or I'll extend that. Fiction is the lie that tells the truth about the human psyche, or about psychotherapy. And that's why I've sort of been engaging in the idea of trying to teach through writing fiction, or teach through writing stories. Are you surprised that I thought you were a therapist?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I were. But I actually think I'd make a pretty lousy therapist, because I would probably talk most of the session. But, you know, I actually think that, well, first of all, it's a compliment that you would think that therapists wrote the show. It just shows how credible it was. But when I think about it, I don't think a therapist could have written the show. You not included. I think most therapists would not make good writers, because I've been in touch with a lot of therapists, both because of In Treatment and because of Wednesday Evenings, a novel. I get invited to all kinds of official gatherings, the yearly psychoanalytical convention or the psychiatrist convention, and I'm like the guest speaker, or the entertainment, depends on how you look at it. And one of the things I've realized, it doesn't surprise me, but that they take, at least my fiction, very, very seriously. And they see meanings, very deep meanings in it, which I had no intention. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was talking about the novel Wednesday Evenings, which is about group therapy, and the therapist is sort of wild, out of control, seductress kind of things. And she has a clinic in Tel Aviv, and the clinic is described in one of these very old buildings, which has tiles, old Arab-style tiles, with colors and designs. And I was invited to speak at a convention of psychoanalysts last year. And the person, one of the therapists who was giving an introduction, she actually gave a paper. She was talking for about an hour and a half about the inner meanings of everything, including the floor. And she read into it these Freudian deep things. And I was sitting there, and I was like that. And I didn't know what to do. I had to tell the truth, because analysts are supposed to be able to handle it. And when she finished this lecture, I said, you know what, it's really interesting, your take on the book. But if you really want to know why those tiles made it into the book, the meaning of the floor is that when I was writing those chapters, I was renovating my house. And I was busy choosing tiles, and that's all I had on my mind. Tiles and tiles and tiles. And she was devastated. She was devastated. And there was a passage about the therapist was wearing pink bazooka-colored nail polish, scratched. And she was giving this about how sexual this was, and the red, and I was like, oh my God. And I told her, and the reason why I chose this particular shade is because at the time I still have 2 daughters who are older now, but they were very young and they used to play. And their favorite color was bazooka pink. And because they're little girls, it always gets chapped and scratched. I don't know, I think she jumped off the bridge after this. It was just like, so yeah.
Yeah, we always, as writers always will take something of their own lives and put it in the book. I'm just reading Yehoshua's latest novel about the 20th page, and the old man and the character in that book is gone out of the hotel room, and he's left his hearing aids there, and he's very worried whether he can get through the day's ceremonies without his hearing aids. I will bet $20 easily that Yehoshua has just gotten hearing aids, because we put things like that from our own life in the book. So for me, the therapy looked very real to me. I thought Gabriel Byrne was a very flawed but very good therapist. And for some of the characters in that work, he just did amazing therapy. For others, he didn't do too well. But I know that there have been times after I watched the show after the first year, and I even know that the therapy is very much like my therapy. And my name gets mentioned somewhere in the end of the first year. But still, I will stop, and I'm with a patient, I'm a little stumped, and I can't help thinking, what would Gabriel Burns have done at this moment, So that's how real the show was for me. He's a flawed therapist in many ways, and there are certain problems of his own that he can't solve. There's certain boundary and attachment problems. He gets into trouble with some of the females that he's seeing, and he never can solve that. And finally, at the end of the show, he really decides that he can't do this work anymore. But he is still able to make major relationships with people. He has deeply human encounters with people that are quite amazing to me. And these are people in therapy. These are the things that really count. If you make a kind of a close, intimate relationship with someone, and that person may never have had an encounter like that before, but from that point on, they have some type of internal reference point, internal anchor, what it means to have a deep relationship, which will serve them very well in their outside life. And that's what he does so beautifully.
So maybe this is a good time to stop and show 2 clips from the show and move to discussing the show more in details. The first clip that we're going to see, this is from as I said before, this is from the version, the original version that aired in Israel in Hebrew with English subtitles. So this is a short clip from a session that Yael Hedaya wrote first season.
התגובה כזאת. קרה שם משהו, נכון? אולי בעצם הבחורה הזו מזכירה לך אותך באותו גיל, ממש בגיל 15?
מה זאת אומרת?
גם את חווית איזה סוג של כמעט מוות, אחרי שאמא שלך נפטרה. ולטפל באבא שלך בשנים שאחרי זה גם סוג של מוות, לא?
אולי.
לא אולי, בטוח. ילד לא אמור לטפל בהורים שלו, נעמה. זה נוגד את כל חוקי הטבע. זה עונש שלא מגיע לאף ילד בעולם.
אז מה תעשה? מה? זה החיים, הם לא הוגנים. מה אתה רוצה, לתבוע את אלוהים?
מי את היית תובעת?
אותך? לא יודעת. אתה רואה, זה בדיוק הבעיה שלי עם פסיכולוגיה. אתה חופר וחופר ומוצא כל מיני סקופים על עצמך, ואתה נוגע בכל מיני נקודות כואבות, אבל מה זה עוזר? לא, באמת אני שואלת, אני לא צינית. בשביל מה זה טוב? מה זה עוזר לי היום לדעת כמה סבלתי אז? נמאס לי לרחם על עצמי.
אני חושב שאת לא מרחמת על עצמך מספיק.
שונאת לרחם על עצמי.
מה עוד?
Okay, and the second clip that we're going to watch is when the therapist is meeting a therapist. So, yeah, it's on a different DVD, so it will take us a minute, but bear with us. Do you think that if you'll just do play, it would work or no? Yeah, here it is. Yeah.
נראה בני עקיבא כזה, נשבעת לך.
No, it's not the right place. So let me move it. It needs to be.
מטופלים חדשים?
כן, אני חושב שבשביל להוכיח לעצמי שהכל בסדר, שאני... יש אחד, טייס, בחור שחצן, הוא באמת רוצח. הוא הוריד פצצה על גן ילדים וחטף אחרי זה התקף לב. והוא כאילו לא רואה מה הקשר. ואני יושב שם, כולי אכול רגשות אשם על זה שאני כאילו מדבר איתו רגיל, בזמן שאני פשוט מגעיל אותי. אני לא יודע מה זה. משבר גיל 50. וקיבלתי השבוע עוד אחת. מישהי שלמדה עם רונה.
אתה מטפל בחברה של הבת שלך?
היא לא חברה שלה, היא למדה איתה בכיתה המקבילה.
נעלבת?
ממה?
זה שקורא לך רוצח.
כן. תראי, גילה, אני יודע שאני מטפל טוב, אבל השבוע האחרון... אולי אני רק צריך מישהו שירגיע אותי, ויגיד לי שאני בסדר. את תמיד אמרת שהבעיה הכי גדולה שלנו זה שאין לנו קהל. זה נכון. אין מי שיגיד לנו מילה טובה. אין מישהו שיגיד שהיינו מצוינים בפגישה הזאת. אין למי להגיד, ראית איך הובלתי אותו כל הפגישה בדיוק לאן שרציתי? שמעת מה עניתי לו? תמיד אמרתי לך שאני חושב שבגלל זה פסיכולוגים הולכים להדחה.
אני התכוונתי בזה שאין לנו קהל, שאין מי שיבקר אותנו.
בסדר, זה...
Okay. So we can close the computer because we're done. The first question I wanted to ask Yael is if you can say something about the differences between the Hebrew version and the English version of the series. Sorry.
Well, I haven't watched the entire version of the American season. I've only watched a few episodes of the first season. And the one thing I can tell you, which is the budget, oh my God, is like the Israeli version was done with such little budget as most Israeli TV shows. And even the couch, the infamous couch, is actually, it wasn't brought in specially. It's a couch in the office of the production company, and people just sit on it, usually. And so I sat on it once when I was meeting with other writers, and they told me, don't spill the coffee on the couch, we need it for filming. We'd never have that in HBO. Just to see the HBO version is like, wow. You know, the very rich uncle with the beautiful Ralph Lauren, Laura Ashley kind of decor, and it has a different look. It has a cleaner, American kind of look, whereas the Israeli version is more, you know, a mishmash. And I think that it also reflects on the atmosphere. I think the HBO version is excellent. But there's something about the Israeli version, and I wonder if you'd agree with me with what you've seen so far. More out of control. The fact that I heard it's like unheard of in the States to call your therapist by the first name. You usually call him doctor or professor. No? Somebody noted that in one of my talks that in Israel they refer to the therapist as, their first name.
California, too.
California. Well, California.
New York. It's a difference.
We're talking about New York. So I think the Israeli version has a little bit more of the Israeli chutzpah in it. It's you can see the seams. It's not as elegant, and I think that reflects also on the body language of the patient and the therapist. It's like the difference between driving on an Israeli highway and driving on an American highway. When you drive on an Israeli highway, you have a lot of this and screaming, and here it's supposedly more cultured.
Well, I've seen a few of the hours of the Hebrew one in this, and some of the differences I've noted is that there is a kind of, maybe it's an Israeli national characteristic. I have to be a little careful here, but there is a kind of pugnaciousness, a kind of argumentativeness that goes on much, even in this little clip here with the patient, that goes on all the time. And between the therapist and his consultant, Gina, there is, and we saw just a little clip of that, but in the Israeli version it goes on and on. They're saying, not here, but they're saying absolutely awful things to one another, very insulting things, and it goes on, and they don't mind it. They're perfectly comfortable. Now that's done a little bit in the American version, but after 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of it, then Diane Weiss gives that huge beguiling smile that is just a lovely smile, and it's so to say, well, we really love each other despite what we're saying. There is no smile like that in the Israeli version at all. But you watch the American version, a smile comes up every few minutes as somehow to kind of diffuse the dialogue that's going on between the two of them. So that's one major difference. I was surprised how similar they were, though. I didn't know. I mean, the American one, and many of in your session, in Laura, the woman we saw here, it's virtually a translation, word for word. It's exactly the same. And some, of course, with the pilot, it's an Israeli pilot versus an American pilot who's bombing in Iraq. They have to change the story, but much of the story is exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And the setting is the same too. I mean, it's in the house. And the house is, of course, some therapists will talk about that quite a bit, because there aren't any real boundaries in the whole production in many ways between patient and therapist. There are no boundaries between the office and where he lives. You hear the people upstairs. You hear people in the sink. The patients are thirsty, they'll go into his bathroom or take some pills out of his medicine cabinet. That does not happen.
As long as they don't swallow them.
As long as they don't swallow them, right, but she did. But that doesn't happen. I think U.S. therapists really keep much stricter boundaries about their living space and their office space. So those are some differences that occur to me.
Yeah, I know. I have a friend who's a therapist in New York. Mm-hmm. And he has an office in a building which is like a skyscraper, just therapists, entirely rented out. It's scary. Would you go into such a building? But he rents a space there, and it's like people coming out of corridors and going, and it's all very well organized, and patients don't meet each other, but it's wow.
Some of the offices are arranged that the patients come into the office through one door and leave through another door, so there isn't that chance of meeting. But Stanford, the waiting room's all the same, and you'll see people.
Are there some favorite moments that you really like from the show?
For me, there are a lot of astounding moments. There is in the third year an Indian character named Sunil.
I'm not familiar.
Do you know that? Well, so he had this relationship with this Indian man who ended up, in a sense, tricking him into calling the police, but the man really wanted to go back to Calcutta, and there was no other way he could figure. So, but they had a conversation between the two of them that was, I felt, very, very powerful and moving. And to me, and your character, Laura, I mean, that was a riveting episode there. And for those of you who may remember the show, Gabriel Burns, that's his major boundary violation. He falls in love with this young woman, and eventually he can't help but give in to that. He knows he's breaking every professional boundary. He knows it could cost him his whole career, but he has to. They've stopped therapy, and he has to call her and go over to see her at his home. And then just before he goes, she's waiting for him in the bedroom. She's already undressed. We see that. And he goes in the bedroom, and the scene ends. And that is so powerful. Because the next episode then shows him in the therapist's office. And he has this absolutely riveting discussion with Diane Weiss about what's happened. What's happened is he had a major panic attack and could not go into the bedroom. And he was feeling so bad about that. And he had broken every rule. The panic attack stopped him from just being in bed with her. And she's trying to persuade him that panic attack was you. You know, it didn't come out of the blue. It was part of you, and the better part of you. And so she did terrific therapy with him.
Do you have any favorite?
I can't remember, and
You're too much.
yeah, I'm too involved.
Yes. So maybe you can tell us something about the challenges, the complexities, the unexpected twists and turns of writing about therapy on the screen. You talked about writing literature, but is there anything different about writing therapy for TV series? Can't hear you. Sorry. So I'm sorry. So I asked her about the challenges, the complexities, the unexpected twists and turns for writing for the TV, for the screen, rather than for writing literature.
Yeah. Well, when you're writing literature, then you are in complete control of what you're doing, and you're a one-man show, and nobody tells you what to do, and you're sitting in your little attic, not that anybody has an attic, but something like that. And you could be there for 5 years just typing away, and then you show it to your editor, and then the editor has comments, or she or he doesn't, and that's it. And writing for TV is a joint production. It's not all up to you. You have an editor, you have a director, you have the creator in this case, and then you have the producer, who says, too expensive, take that scene out. Or, this is no good, this is not good, this is going to cost us another day of filming. And above that, you have the broadcaster, and they have their say, and they don't want this and they don't want that, and if we're showing it on this and that hour, then this cannot be said, and this can be said, and this is not appropriate, and this is appropriate. It was on cable, so it didn't matter, and of course, you have the actors and the actresses who have their own opinion. And they can say, I can't say that. I want to say this. I want to say that. And, in the United States, everything is very organized. And you have a writer's room. And if any changes are to be made, you call up the writer's room at any hour. And you say, can we change the word good to nice? In Israel, it's chaos, and sometimes as a writer, you end up watching something that you didn't write. And being a writer with your writer ego, you usually hate what's been done to your baby. And there was a lot of clashes around this or that. I mean, I think the product that came out was excellent, but sometimes it just wasn't mine. And it was very difficult to watch lines which I hadn't written, or I would tell the creator who would make a suggestion, why doesn't she say this? And I would say, because I hate it. And she's not going to say it. And when I watched it, there it was, the line that I hated. And I was like, ah! But it was, so there's less control over what you do when you're writing to screen. On the other hand, it's fun. It's not as lonely as being a writer, a fiction writer. I mean, I love the loneliness, but this is also like you meet, you have coffee, you scream, you argue, and I remember Asi Dayan, the one who plays the therapist, and some of you may be familiar with the name. He's a very famous Israeli actor and director and the son of Moshe Dayan, and quite an outrageous, temperamental character. And he walked into a meeting with writers one day just to say what he thought of the first drafts of the first week. And we were all sitting there, and he stormed him, and he said, "You're horrible writers, and I hate everything you did, and I don't know why you were hired." And that was it. We never heard from him again until it was on. So he was wrong.
It's quite a story. Quite a story.
Do you have a similar experience with when Nietzsche wept?
Well, when Nietzsche wept was, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie. It's out on Netflix and cable. It never got distributed in this country. It was a sort of small budget movie. They had a very good leading character named Armando Asante, and they had he was Nietzsche, and a secondary character was a pretty good actor named Ben Cross. They didn't have enough money really for any of the other roles, and a lot of them are not very good actors. I saw the script 15 times. The director, writer of that movie loved the novel, and what he did was try to put the book right on the screen. Hardly a word was changed, and for that reason it was not a highly successful movie. And I kept trying to change things, and I send them back, and they really weren't changed. So I really couldn't influence that very much at all. But I think if the writer tries to put the book onto the screen, it's going to be a failure. It's got to be adapted. I have another book called Lying on the Couch, a novel that's being put on the screen now. And this is handled very differently. It's by a Hollywood insider, good screenwriter. He's written movies like Ocean's 11, and he's written a lot of good movies. And so he showed me the script after he first draft, wanted to know if I had any thoughts, but didn't listen to anything I said. I found the draft, was this my book? Exactly, and it's very vulgar. I thought, and I felt a little embarrassed by that. They changed the name, it's called Shoot the Messenger, which has nothing to do with the novel, but I don't have any voice at all in what happened. I think it will be made, though. I know they've got Anthony Hopkins and some other good actors signed up for it. So that's my major experience with that. With writing, yeah, you're totally your own master. But when I first tried to write outside of textbooks, then I had a major jump. You do have an editor, and I wrote that book of Love's Executioner. I wrote 10 stories. They flowed very quickly. Marilyn, my wife, and I had traveled around the world. I was a year sabbatical and had 3 months in Bali, and one story just flowed from another. I wrote it very easily, and my original intention was I was going to write these 10 nice stories about psychotherapy, pretty faithful to what happened, and then I was going to write a very, very long afterward. I envisioned I did, 60 pages I wrote, saying what I was really trying to say in the stories. And then I was assigned basic books. I was assigned an editor from hell, who, in many ways was an editor from heaven, because she really taught me a lot. But her vision was, no, if I'm going to tell you anything in the story, if I'm going to teach anything, you've got to let the story do the telling. And so we battled almost as long as it took me to write the book, to write the introduction, from 60 pages down to 10. But there were 10 good pages, and I learned how to really teach through the story itself. So that was the first real lesson for me. And the same thing, of course, in writing a novel. I have certain ideas that I start a novel, I'm going to try to teach a certain kind of intention. When I wrote my first novel, When Nietzsche Wept, I thought it would be interesting to teach psychotherapy to young students of psychotherapy by transporting them back to the time of Freud. And they could actually witness how the first psychotherapy was put together, how it was invented. You know, it's like teaching a mechanic to work on a car by having him go to the factory and see how it's made. That was the idea I had in mind. So that was one of the things I had in mind. And I had a few other ideas about what would psychotherapy be like if it was invented by a philosopher and not by a physician scientist like Freud? If it had been invented by Nietzsche, what would psychotherapy look like? So I wanted to do that. I wanted to show in this book how a lot that Nietzsche wrote is very relevant to psychotherapy. So I had all these ideas in mind, and the book, in a sense, that's what I wanted to accomplish through this book. And then once I started writing the novel, then, as all writers will tell you, it takes off on its own. It goes in directions you could never possibly have imagined. I know some people will write, certainly mystery writers, outline the whole novel in advance, but I've never been able to do that. You know, I write the first chapter and I really don't know what's going to happen. You just sort of listen to what the characters are saying to one another and write it down.
Can you relate to that?
No, I wanted to add one more thing to what I said, that writing, you know, when you're writing fiction, it's a quiet kind of profession, and you never really get to hear the voices of the characters. You hear them in your mind. You know, sometimes you're crazy. You're walking around and you have voices in your mind, and when you're writing for the screen, you actually get these people materialize, and it's totally different. And I sometimes can't decide what I like more, but I think that writing for the screen is faster. You don't write a program. It doesn't take 5 years or 4 years to write a 45-minute show or 30-minute show. And I don't know, it's two parts of me which I like, and sometimes I do this and sometimes I do that. It's a different kind of suffering to write for the screen, because writing for the screen, the suffering is inflicted upon you by others, producers, directors, and bad actors. And when writing a novel, it's self-inflicted injuries that you're doing to yourself all the time. So.
Before we move to talking about group therapy, because we asked you if you could discuss that, I wanted to ask you about the impact of the show. You said that
Oh, wow.
you have some stories about that.
Yeah. Well, In Treatment really, it had a huge impact on the professionals in Israel, psychologists, psychiatrists, who, like you, thought it was really well done, and it was like a real big thing. It's taught at universities in psychology classes, but it also had a huge impact on the audience. And for people who were not in therapy ever, it was like a peek into what goes on in a therapist's clinic. And I remember the advisor, we had an advisor on the show, Dr. Ronnie Batt, who was reading the script, and he wasn't really interfering, but he told us, this is what you can say, this is what you wouldn't say. And he told us that after the first week the show aired, his mom called him up and said, so this is what you do. Finally, I know what you do. And, but the funny thing is, people were going to therapy. There was this huge renaissance. Patients who never went decided to try it out. Patients who left therapy were going back. And the horrible thing was that the therapists in Tel Aviv raised their rates to what he was taking. And we just threw out a sum of 450 shekels, which was exuberant at the time. I know it doesn't sound much here, like $125 a session, but for Israel at the time, in 2005, it was like outrageous. But therapists at Tel Aviv started raising their rates according to what Reuven was taking. And patients were so influenced by the therapist that they would tell their therapist, no, you say what he would say. I'll have what she's having. That's it. So, yeah.
So you both wrote about group therapy, and maybe Irvin, you can start. Tell us a little bit about how different it is than writing about.
Well,
other
I wrote.
conversations.
I've had a couple experiences writing about group therapy. I wrote a textbook on group therapy, but that was at a time that I was only writing professional literature. But I always wanted to be a real writer. Had wanted to ever since I was a child. I grew up in Washington, D.C. My parents had come over from Ukraine about 1920. They kept very much in a smaller community composed only of the people who had been in the same shtetl. And in my generation, the idea of your professional choice was extremely limited. All my peers, all my male friends that I knew, all of us felt there were only a couple of possibilities. You either were going to be a doctor or you're going to go in business with your father. That was it. The idea of being a writer or anything, there's no such thing. Sometimes we joke, I've said this at other times, but sometimes we joke that there are only two possible professions. We could become a doctor or we could be a failure. That was the choice. So I went to medical school. I had other reasons for wanting to be a doctor too, but always in the background I wanted to write. So when I started writing group therapy, the textbook, what I began to do was smuggle short stories all through it. The stories were a few sentences or paragraph, or some places as many as 5 to 10 pages long. And I'm certain that that's a major part of why that particular textbook has been successful. And I've done the same thing with other textbooks. And when I started writing Love's Executioner, that was really total jumping off the pier for me, going into a whole new mode of writing. So the textbook of group therapy, and I began to wonder about how I could do some teaching. I wrote in a sense, I did, now that I'm thinking about it, I had forgotten all about it, but I did a screenplay. We made some tapes of characters. We had spent a day interviewing potential actors, and they made tapes of an outpatient group and an inpatient group. And so these have been used as teaching tapes for the last 30 years or so. And then I tried to write, I wrote a novel called The Schopenhauer Cure. And that novel, that entire novel is a novel that's set in a therapy group. And I've got some heavier existential themes in there because the leader of the group is a man who has malignant melanoma, and he's going to continue to lead this group, but he's looking back through his life and going back through his old charts and looking at patients that he's seen, and his eye falls on one of his great failures, and he decides he's going to get in touch with this man again, who is a man. I wanted to put Schopenhauer in a therapy group, but when Schopenhauer lived, there was no psychotherapy of any kind. Being in a therapy group would have been hell for Schopenhauer, his version of hell, because he was a great misanthrope. But I created a character about who was a Schopenhauer clone, just like him. And so he was one of the characters that I put into this group, and he was one of 7 characters that I followed them through the novel. And I try to write the novel and trying to demonstrate that what we're doing in group therapy is primarily interpersonally based. We're trying to help each person understand as much as he can about the way he relates to each person in that group, in that here and now of the group. Because if he does that, the group's a kind of microcosm of our entire society. So if you understand what's going on in the here and now of the group, you'll be able to understand what's going on between you and a whole vast array of the people in your life. Same thing is true for individual therapy. In your character, Laura, when the therapist is working with Laura, and he's trying to talk to her about her falling in love with an older man. In a sense, they're working in the here and now, but the reason that it's done to help her understand what's happening between the two of us is a reflection of what's happening to you in your outside world. So we use the here and now to reflect. So that book is very much based on the here and now, what's happening. Whole book is really what's happening between the 7 characters in that group and the therapist as well. That's been my major experience in writing about group therapies fictionally. Wednesday.
Well, I have to say that I have a little bit of chutzpah writing a book about group therapy without ever being in group therapy. But it was really, it was an adventure because it's not really your regular group therapy. It's a novel about a support group for parents who think they're doing a really bad job at parenting. And they go to a psychologist who specializes in reforming bad parents. And it started out as an ironical kind of joke I was having with myself. I'm a single mother of 3 kids. One of them is in the audience, so I won't say anymore. But, having watched Super Nanny, a lot of people of my generation and other generations watch Super Nanny, and both the Israeli version and American version, it's like, wow, And I hate her. I really do. And I think that the book started as sort of a joke. Let's take Super Nanny, let's make her into this really good psychologist. She's not a bad psychologist. And let's take a group of these people who think they're really terrible at being parents and sit them down together. And it was messy writing group therapy because you had to be in control of what all these characters are doing. And I've written novels in the past with a lot of characters and different perspectives and points of view. But this time they were all in the same room all at once. And sometimes I felt like, wait a minute, shut up. So, it was a challenge, which I'm not going to do again.
And the book ends in a very interesting way. I'm not going to ruin it for those who didn't read it yet. I don't think it wasn't translated.
Not yet.
Yeah. So, but maybe we'll go back to the end of In Treatment that you mentioned before, Irvin, and the decision to stop therapy, and the main character decides not only to stop being a therapist but stop going to therapy. And I wanted to ask you about the end of therapy and the end of...
There is no end.
Yeah, so the end of the book. When do you decide that this is where it needs to end?
When you're fed up. You just can't take it anymore. No, I don't know. It's a combination of things. I usually don't know where my books are going to end. I work, it's chaos for me. And in the middle of the writing process, I sort of have this kind of image of how I want to end the book. And I know where to lead the plot and characters. But a book could be, sometimes it's just like, it's like I don't know, what do they call those things that fall out of the sky? A comet. It exhausts its own energy at a certain point, and you feel that that's it. You should end it.
Do you need the characters to get to a certain kind of understanding for example, in the therapy, group therapy that you had?
Because this book was about therapy, then some of the characters did have some kind of resolution, and the therapist did lead them to realize things about their lives, and some didn't. And I didn't want to make it too perfect. Had it been, this would answer the question about the difference between screenwriting, because had this been a Hollywood movie, it would be like, no way. Everybody has to be redeemed, and you have to have, so, not in the novel.
One thing that you mentioned to me earlier, that what astounding part of In Treatment is that each of the writers were writing about a character, so they wrote each of the different hours of the days of the week. So, in other words, Gabriel Burns was written by 5 different people, and yet we see it together, and so it's amazing to me that for certain it was written by one person, because he's a very coherent character in each of the 5 settings. So that's a very extraordinary part of the scene for me. Another thing, when you're talking about difference of therapy and writing, I had an experience with a patient years ago, a man who was dealing with an obsessional love affair. He couldn't get over this relationship. It had been over now for almost a year. Couldn't get through it, and kept thinking about her, obsessing about her all the time. And we were a little stuck in therapy. And then on his own, and I didn't know about this, he read When Nietzsche Wept. And the novel isn't a novel about obsession. Both Nietzsche and Breuer have love obsessions that each of them unknowingly help the other to break. But my patient read that book, and after reading it, he came to me and told me the book had helped him marvelously, much more than therapy had, as a matter of fact, and he's ready to stop therapy. So you don't know where people will get their help.
And can you say something about your decisions of when to end the book, the novel?
What you're saying is very, very similar, very familiar to me. I don't know when books are going to end. None of the novels, or even the stories, do I know the end of the book when I'm starting to write the story. Absolutely not. It comes to me later on, and then with some anxiety too. The last book I wrote on Spinoza, I was in a bit of a quandary about how to end that book, and struggled with the ending for 2 or 3 months. Had ended, so I didn't know where it was going to end. Didn't know whether I would end part of the book. Part of the Spinoza book, half the book is about the Nazi Alfred Rosenberg. Or was I going to end it with his being hung at Nuremberg or not? I finally decided to cheat and put that into an epilogue afterwards.
Interesting. Yeah, so I'm not sure we exhausted the topic, but we'll still end here. And we have some time for questions. So.
Irv, can you talk about the difference in your own experience as a therapist and how you endow that within the books that you've written in terms of the therapeutic aspects of it?
You know, I'm really writing, I'm really the character in the books. This book about Spinoza that I just mentioned, well, there's a psychiatrist treating the Nazis, Rosenberg, and there's not a psychiatrist, of course, treating Spinoza, but there's somebody I've invented who has a lot of knowledge of the human psyche, who's a friend of Spinoza, and each of those, it's me. When I'm working with Spinoza, a man who's asking for therapy, he does in real life. We have a letter from Spinoza's psychiatrist to Hitler describing his character problems. I mean, with Rosenberg, we have a letter from Rosenberg's psychiatrist to Hitler. So when I try to work through his resistance to try and help him look at himself, I'm using every technique I know, every one that I've used in my own work with patients. So I feel like I'm very much the character in the book.
Have either of you ever written a story about a therapist who is a bad therapist and the patient commits suicide by, say, taking an overdose of antidepressants prescribed by the therapist?
Well, in treatment, I wrote a book for therapists called The Gift of Therapy, and I have a long section about hazards of psychotherapy as well as blessings of psychotherapy. Among the hazards, I list that the two worst hazards for a psychotherapist are really having a patient suicide and being sued. And Gabriel Burns works with one patient, And both of those things happened to him from that one patient. You know, the pilot commits suicide, most likely, and then is sued by his father. So he is really up against terrible hazards.
Are we going to see that?
Hmm?
Can we see that film?
Oh, yes, it's in treatment. It's in part of the pilots in year 1 of in treatment. So are you asking, have I personally suffered a patient's suicide?
That's a good question, too.
Yeah. No, I haven't. I've been extremely fortunate in that. And perhaps for one of the major reasons that I'm careful about who I select right now as I'm growing older, I'm not picking patients for whom that's a terrible possibility. You know, I have had patients express suicidal thoughts. I try to work with patients many patients think about suicide as a blessed relief from this terrible pain that I'm suffering now. It's a relief from it, finally. But I try to work with their magical thinking, because in that idea that suicide's a blessed relief is the idea that I'm going to be here somehow to experience that relief. And you have to try to help them see that death is permanent, and death's irreversible, and there isn't going to be a consciousness there to experience any kind of relief. So I'll take a kind of existential approach if I possibly can get some leverage in that way.
I'm not a therapist, so I have nothing to add on this, but I will say that in Israel it's different, because psychologists don't, here in the States, psychotherapists are, on the most part, psychiatrists. They can prescribe, well, in some generations.
Right, today they're a very, very tiny proportion of psychotherapists.
But it used to be that way.
Used to be.
Right.
50 years ago, only psychiatrists could do therapy.
Exactly.
And if a psychologist did therapy, they have to be supervised by psychiatrists. That's where it was when I started in the field.
Now, you go to a psychologist if you want to talk, and you go to a psychiatrist if you want a prescription. So psychiatrists usually don't have patients that they see long term, except for, not in Israel anyway.
You talked about fiction as a lie that helps to get to the truth. And Irv, you told the story about your patient who seemed to be helped more by reading When Nietzsche Wept than by the therapy. And I wonder if you could both talk about the power of story to achieve understanding or to help people change, perhaps even more than argument does, or education does, or therapy does.
I can say some things about that. The first thing that I'll just reassociate, first thing that comes to my mind is that wonderful novel by Losa called The Storyteller, in which he demonstrates the power and the place of the storyteller in Amazonian tribal culture. But there is a kind of storytelling in my mind when I see patients. For me, when I work with patients, I feel the story emerging, and I'm very anxious, eager to see my patient the next time, to see what's happened. And to me, that's a very healthy state of mind for a therapist. It is really investing yourself in the patient. When I was first at Stanford, for the first few years, I ran a therapy group. I don't know, Jay, you were maybe one of those residents. So the residents watched my therapy group every week. It was an hour and a half of sitting watching in the dark through one two-way mirror, and they were terribly bored with it. And they were really condemned to this. And then we had another half-hour meeting about that. But after a while, they stopped being so bored. If you really the more you understand about it, it becomes more interesting. And then after a while, they began to refer to it as Yalom's Peyton Place. That was a daytime serial during that time, because it was kind of exciting to see what's happened to each of these people in the last. I love that point of view, that way of looking at a patient. It's not that I'm going to be writing a story about every patient. That happens very, very rarely. But there's something in me that's looking for the story, and I think that helps me do work. Is that the kind of thing you meant by the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I know about the power of storytelling because sometimes readers tell me things about how a certain paragraph or character or moved them, or people say, "How did you know what I'm feeling? How did you? It's about me." And how do you know? And it brings me back to one of the things I said at the beginning, that I think that writers they have a built-in psychologist in their minds, and they're able. I think that a writer is not really that special, except that we writers put into words what everybody already knows. And I think that's what makes it special, to phrase the obvious. And yeah, basically. Oh.
So, hi. As you know, we have many different orientations in psychotherapy, from psychodynamic psychotherapy, psychoanalysis psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, your orientation, existential psychotherapy, recently mindfulness-based psychotherapy. I have noticed a lot of clashes among these orientations, the founders of orientations and the people who are practicing. Do you see any time there would be some conversations among these different orientations, any peace, or where do you see the future of psychotherapy going?
Whenever I'm interviewed by a person and they want to know what kinds of questions I'd like, I always say, please don't ask me about the future of the field. It's very hard for me to answer that. There are conversations all the time. There are people who are trying to create some synthesis. Right now, the major clashes in the field have to do with the cognitive behavioral, which is very well scripted, and it's manualized, and I feel there's too little emphasis on the real relationship with the patient, which I've always felt is the very core of the therapeutic change. So there is a real rift in the field right now, mainly driven by economic factors, because of the insurance companies being willing to pay for relatively few sessions, and the cognitive behavioral is arranged so that it takes only a certain amount of time. But lately, the longer-term research has shown, if you look at therapy that goes on, say, for about 20 sessions, there's very little difference between cognitive behavioral therapy and a more analytically based, more intensive therapy. And in fact, there's a little bit of an edge in favor of the intensive therapy in that the effects seem longer lasting. But those debates are going on very, very powerfully in the field right now. Mainly, I believe, driven by economic factors. And who is it that's paying for therapy?
In the television program, you have, I think, the unique experience of getting inside the mind of the therapist. I'm over here. And it's almost uncomfortable, but in reading Irv's books, you get the feeling that he actually, I mean, that's part of the therapy, getting personal with your therapist. And that's part of the therapy. And I was just wondering whether this is a widely held practice, or whether it just happens that the two of you are so alike that this conversation is working so well.
I see that more as a compliment than a question. I don't know. Do you have an
Well, that's why I love the show so much. I'm saying, oh, this is the way I like to do therapy. That's why I think, what would Gabriel Burns have said? And then I feel a little troubled when he goes over the edge. but in terms of how much do you reveal yourself as a person in the therapy, there are tremendous debates and differences. You know, the older time, very strict Freudian analysts once reveal nothing of himself. Even his own person is invisible because he'll sit at the head of the couch and not within the view of the patient. And Freud had an idea about that. He wanted the patient to transfer feelings from his earliest surroundings onto the therapist. So he didn't want the therapist to be visible in his life, and that was Freud's rationale. But as things have evolved, I feel the growing evidence that it's the relationship that's even more important than the study of transference. So I tend to be pretty far out on one edge of the continuum about how much of myself I'm willing to reveal. You know, and there are certain. Most therapists will agree that that it's fine to reveal a great deal about how therapy works. If patients have questions about therapy, I try to demystify therapy. Then there's the whole question of how much you reveal in the here and now with the patient, how much you reveal about your own feelings about the patient. Again, I think if you do that tactfully and responsibly, you can reveal a lot about what's going on between the two of you. And I emphasize that tremendously in my therapy. The big area of debate is how much you reveal about your own personal life. And I tend to be rather lax about that. If the patient asks me if I've got children or if I've seen such and such a movie or seen such and such a book, what's the big deal? Yes, I much more important keeping the therapy relationship alive and intact and try to be a real person there. There's always the fear that the patients will ask more and more of you. You know, they want to know more about your sexual life or what are your masturbation habits or whatever. You reveal a little bit, you open the door. That never happens. It really doesn't happen. And if it does, if it were to happen, then the therapist always has an answer to that if you focus on the relationship. Because then you begin to wonder, what's the payoff in you for embarrassing me? Let's see what you get out of that. Why is it important for you to make me feel embarrassed? So that's how I would work in therapy.
Yael, you said earlier that we writers, we have a built-in psychology. We state the obvious. However, it's not so obvious. You state what is not said. Maybe wanted to be said, but is not said. Do you think that there is something about your upbringing that made you said, that made you able to sense and to see and to write about what is not said?
That's a good question, and it's very difficult to answer. Why do artists become artists? Why do certain people become writers? Why do certain people become musicians? Or why does... I'm starting to believe that you're born with it. You're born with a certain kind of personality, and there's all kinds of explanations for the personality. Today, there are more medical explanations for the creative personality, and it's, in a way, fascinating but sort of disappointing to find out that you're a writer because of really bad brain chemistry. And that, you're neurotic or you're suffering or you're very... they used to think about children in the romantic times where there was no neurological studies as difficult kids or kids who are dreamy or kids... And now it's ADHD and now it's ADD. And I think that on the one hand, somebody who is talented and gifted without us knowing that it's really electrical brain activity or the lack of. And the fact that you're a child who suffers more than other children or who cannot get over watching a dog limping on the street for weeks. If I was that kind of kid, that if I would have seen something like that, something that wasn't even sad to another person. I'm not talking about like a dog getting hit by a car. I'm talking about something visually gets stuck in your mind. And I could go on for months, driving my parents crazy. And I would be depressed and I would be miserable. And eventually all this lava goes out someplace. So if you're creative and talented, then in a way you're lucky or maybe unlucky, and you're destined to do something with all this horrible stuff. Other people go crazy or kill themselves. I'm serious. So I don't really know how to explain this. It's, yeah.
But you are a real risk taker.
Yeah.
In Laura, you're taking a lot of risks in that. I thought you had a lot of courage in writing that.
But you see, the writer doesn't think
Yeah.
he or she is taking risks. A lot of people say this to me, wow, you're so brave. You're exposing your personal life, even though you don't go out and say, this is me.
Yeah.
You know, the audience is smart and readers are smart, and they'll guess that this and that is about you. Or I don't think that the writers see this as an act of courage. It's an impulse. And we write about ourselves because we know ourselves the best. And being personal, I think, is easier. Because we're also very lazy. So why go out and look for somebody else's traumas when we could use our own? And we have a lot, plenty of them.
In treatment, in the Laura section that you wrote, there is this impasse going on between Laura and Gabriel Burns. And then you have Laura meeting one of his other patients, a male patient, with whom she immediately has an affair.
Right.
Did you plan that from the beginning?
No, that's TV.
Huh?
That's the way TV works.
Yeah.
I could be writing, minding my own business, and we've had 4 sessions, and then the creator or producer or director says, okay, we need something going on. We got to get something happening here. How about the next episode she meets him and they have an affair and it drives him crazy. So I don't even know if this was my idea.
You don't know if it's your
No.
idea. No.
I mean,
It felt that way. It felt like it was pretty consistent, but it was shocking.
I don't remember really. It could have been like a joint kind of idea, but this is the way TV works.
I see.
You sit down and you say, we got to make this more exciting. We got to make this more interesting. And that's also the difference between real life and therapy on the screen. This kind of stuff usually does not happen in real life.
Oh, if you were to do a TV show of a good therapist and a patient who's performing very well, you know, it could be very boring.
Yeah.
It really could be.
Yeah, we like naughty therapy.
Yeah, you've got to have a flawed therapist.
Right.
But you know, we always say in therapy, it's really not the errors you make, it's what you do with them. How do you use the error? So that, and I think that's very important in treatment.
Right.
It's an old statement from a writer named Winnicott, who's an important
I know.
theorist. Yeah.
On this lively note.
There's no room for the antithesis, which is to say, this is not psychological enough. They can say it's not dramatic enough, but there's no room to say it's not psychologically true. Like the story about the panic attack was fundamentally psychologically valid as could be. The flip side doesn't exist. Am I getting that correctly?
No. I'm not saying that it can't really happen. Is that what you mean?
What I mean is you invent an affair that doesn't make much psychological sense for dramatic purposes. There's no room to come back and say, this really doesn't make a lot of psychological sense. It doesn't fit together. I mean,
in TV, you don't want to make psychological sense. You want to make drama.
Yeah, okay.
And I think you could say this about therapeutic sessions. Sometimes you feel there's not enough drama in the therapy, and you want to generate the drama.
Right.
Which is between the therapist and patient.
Right.
You see, as you say that, it's very interesting to me because I love that scene. And I love this having a panic attack. And I think you're probably right. I think it's probably quite improbable psychologically. And yet, I kind of just pushed all that aside. I just love the way that it went. And I'm happy with him having a panic attack. And happy with...
No, the panic attack I thought was terrific.
Yeah. Oh, so what was
So
it?
maybe I didn't
The idea of
understand your
inventing
question.
an affair because the therapy, the show's getting boring.
Right.
No. That's not the reason. The affair was something that we were leading to, and there was a lot of debate about how it's going to actually end. Will they sleep together? Will
How
he...
much say did you have in how it was going to end?
Well, I invented the panic attack. Yeah, I invented the panic attack. I thought it would be awful. I mean, on the one hand, it would be beautiful, I think, television-wise, to actually have them sleep together. But we thought a lot about how we're going to end this. And I think that episode was written like 10 times, different versions.
I mean the episode where the patient meets another patient and they have the affair. That's what seemed so artificial. The story about the panic attack seemed completely psychological.
Oh, that seemed artificial. I see. I don't know. Maybe.
I was very curious as a writer when I saw him go to that patient's bedroom. I'm thinking, how are you going to end this? We're coming. I know it's the last time, the last session they're going to meet. It's the end of the show. I couldn't imagine how you're going to do it. And then I see he enters the show and it ends. I thought that's perfect, absolutely perfect.
Yeah, it's perfect. And I admit that it was the director's choice, not mine, because what I wanted to do, which I realize now wouldn't have been as powerful. Because the ending that you're referring to is sort of like the ending of The Sopranos, where Tony looks in a certain direction and there's a black screen, which a lot of people have discussed, and I know that the world is very busy with David Chase's choice. Some people were very upset, and some people loved it. So my choice would have been different. I thought that they should start having sex, and he should have a panic attack in the middle. And that's what I wrote. But then the director decided that he wants this ending, and I agree, it's better.
It ended up being better opportunity for Gina to give him some good therapy too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on this note, please join us in thanking Yael Hedaya and Irvin Yalom for a great conversation. Thank you.